You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. It is broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program is usually produced from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne because of COVID-19 Stage 4 restrictions and Stage 3 restrictions. We're broadcast from outside the radio station. There may be technical issues. If there are technical issues, my apologies, but obviously the Community Radio Network, Community Radio 3CR and myself, we're all doing what we can to ensure that you continue to get an up-to-date analysis of what's happening. This program is going live to air. I prefer to go live so I can give you a more up-to-date analysis of what's going on. Look, we'll start off with a COVID-19 update as Melbourne, metropolitan Melbourne, will be going to Stage 4 lockdown in a few hours. I think it's important that we look at the reasons we're here. I've been very patient, and I'm sure a lot of other people have been very patient regarding the government's response, especially the Victorian state government's response to COVID-19. And although we're supposedly in this together, the fact is that there's been a lot of mistakes made in the last few months, since March, a lot of mistakes made, especially in Victoria. And I don't think the Premier's hectoring, lecturing ways is the best way to bring the community on board. I mean, to say if the police want more powers, they simply have to ask, gives you an example of the desperation that the current government is in. And to a significant degree, I think people are expecting the government to actually accept responsibility for the current situation because of their save a penny, spend a pound attitude to the quarantine as far as overseas travellers were concerned, which I'm sure we'll find out was the beginning of this current wave. So I think if the Premier wants people to actually get involved, to obey the rules, there aren't enough police or army officers in a city of 5 million to maintain control. He needs community support, and he needs widespread community support. And obviously we all know the COVID-19 issue. We know that social distancing is important, that masks are important, that the only way to stop transmission or decrease transmission in an area where there's no vaccination, in an area where there's no treatment, is for human beings to do things which human beings normally don't do, because we're basically herd animals. We like other human beings. We like to congregate. We need to congregate. We need to talk. We need to touch each other, and the list goes on and on. So I think that if the Premier wants Victorians to get behind this Stage 4 restrictions, and it does need voluntary support, not coercive support. As I said before, there are not enough police officers or army personnel in this country to ensure that the lockdown is successful. The lockdown will only be successful if there is community support, and I think he needs to look at the way people have been addressed in this state regarding what needs to be done. People do not like to be lectured to. They don't like to be threatened. They don't like to be told they must do this and they must do that. people know they must do this and they must do that if they want to decrease the incidence of COVID-19 in the community. So what needs to happen is for the Premier to tone down his rhetoric, to bring the community in, to make us one group of people. I mean, not divide us and try to threaten and frighten people by increasing penalties, by coercing people, because that type of activity does not work unless you've got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of police and military personnel to enforce those rules, which doesn't happen in this country currently anyway. So it's a matter of bringing the community together to understand the need for what needs to be done. Secondly, I find it extraordinary that during this difficult time for small businesses, especially small businesses, I find it extraordinary that legislation hasn't been passed that allows small businesses to, one, walk away from leases. Many small businesses are going to be bankrupted. Tens of thousands of small business people in this state and around this country will be bankrupted in the next, if not hundreds of thousands, the next few years. And a lot of these businesses have signed leases which they cannot get out of, which they will be pursued for, which will mean they'll have to sell their homes, and the list goes on and on. Nobody's talking about passing legislation now. The Premier has declared a state of disaster. A state of disaster means in Victoria the Premier can ignore any legislation that has been passed by Parliament. He has basically become a one-man band. That's what he's become. He could tomorrow announce that any business that wants to walk away from a failing business, from a failed business, can walk away and break a lease with no penalty. At the same time, he can announce that the banks, if there are any owners of premises who have mortgages, the banks need to forget about those mortgages until that building is released. So there are many things can be done economically, not just a bit of government borrowing. Many things that can be done economically to ensure that we weather this crisis physically, emotionally, and economically. Many things that are not being done. I find it extraordinary during this period to see people like Twiggy Forrest and Gina Reinhart, still pile on the cash because they are in a position where they exploit our mineral resources, the people's mineral resources. It's extraordinary to see people with a personal wealth, that's a personal wealth of over $20 billion, which is $20,000 million. When you talk about 20 billion, it doesn't seem like much, but when you talk about $20,000 million, you begin to understand the extraordinary wealth they have. And I think it's time as a society that we need to raise the significant issue of how we are going to deal with this situation economically over the next few years. And the thing that springs to my mind, and I think the thing that springs to most other people's mind, is that we live in the Commonwealth of Australia. The wealth should be held in common. We should be debating and passing legislation to nationalise this country's mineral resources, coal, uranium, bauxite, diamond, gold, rare earth, lithium, and the list goes on and on and on. That we nationalise these resources so that we can use the income that comes from the exploitation of these resources to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and to deal with structural inequality which occurs in our society. These are debates we need to have. We need to take action, and we need to take it quickly. It's no use hectoring people. It's no use saying to people, well, you're going to lose your job and you've got to apply for this and you've got to apply for job seeker or that. I mean, it is so difficult for so many people to get the resources they need to keep body and soul together. And if there's one thing I've noticed since March, the bills still keep coming. they still keep coming. They haven't decreased. I mean, there's been some temporary arrangements to defer some bills, but in the majority of cases, the bills still keep coming. So why do we find ourselves in this difficult situation? And we find ourselves in this difficult situation for three main reasons. And I'll go through these reasons over and over and over again, because I think it's important that people just don't react, that we should have been in a position where we should have been able to deal with a pandemic much better than we have. And the first thing is, this country has no centre for disease control. Could you imagine that? No centre for disease control. The SARS pandemic in 2008, we have known there is another pandemic on the horizon, and health personnel across the country have been saying over and over and over and over again that we as a society, especially the richer societies, the Western world, should have been in a position to deal with this pandemic much quicker, much better. And we had nothing in place. Everything has been reactive. We're even in a situation where we didn't have and continue not to have enough personal protective equipment for people at the front line treating people with COVID-19. No Centre for Disease Control. No national plan of how to deal with a pandemic. No plan on what to do regarding the economy. No plan put in place on the wearing of masks. No plans at all. Nothing. Although we had years of warning that this was a potential that we had to look after. No planning. Nothing. No reserves. And this is to a significant degree has been because of the privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation agenda that has been pursued for so long by so many governments at the state and federal level, not just in Australia but around the Western world. We are now paying the price of not taking precaution. That's the issue. We had no plans in place whatsoever. No structures, no organisation, no funded structures, nothing. So if there's one lesson to be learned when this pandemic is over, and it will be over, like every pandemic eventually splutters out, and it may take a while, but it will be over, and I think people need to remember that it will be over, that we need to redirect resources, significant resources, in such a way as to be able to deal with the next pandemic, because this will not be a one-in-a-century event, as we are told. Things have changed since 1919. There are many more people on the planet. We are making more incursions into the natural world. There is a greater transfer of disease, especially viruses, from the animals to humans, and this will continue to be a feature. And unless we have plans in place and structures in place to deal with the situation until there's vaccination or treatment for a specific virus, then we will find ourselves in the same situation over and over again. I think the second thing that we need to remember is that what this has demonstrated to us is the necessity for a universal basic income. In a capitalist society, a society which is based on private investment for private profit, the maxim is very simple. Increase profits for your major shareholders, irrespective of the human, social, environmental and national costs. And pursuing a policy, as we've seen during this 40 years of deregulation, privatisation, globalisation and corporatisation. Pursuing these policies has created a situation where more and more and more people are being left behind. Let's not remember that 6 to 9 months ago, people on unemployment benefits, people on social security benefits of any type were demonised in this country. They were called leaners. The 1/3 of the population which relied on social security benefits was somehow, not even a human being in this country. And now they want people to pull together. And I think people need to remember that if they want us to pull together, and we do need to pull together, and I've got no problem with that, we need to change the economic system. We need to look at the question of a universal basic income to protect individuals and families and communities from disasters. Not just disasters from pandemic, but disasters which will occur as CO2 emissions continue to increase. Let's not forget, although there's a pandemic, nothing else has changed. We continue to pursue policies of promoting CO2 emissions, especially in this country. I'll just give you an aside. We've been talking about carbon capture and putting a lot of money into carbon capture in Australia now for some time. And the pioneers of carbon capture in the United States of America have now actually, that's NRG Energy, have closed down because carbon capture does not work. What was the federal government's response to the closure of NRG? They said, well, we will continue to do research, we will continue to work on carbon capture, not recreate the mining sector in order to compensate workers in the coal region. No, we're not doing that. So that's the trouble with living in a society based on a wage system. There is no protection for individuals, and a universal basic income, which I've been talking about now for decades, is what is needed to protect individuals and people from economic disaster, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's increasing CO2 emissions. We need some mechanism via which people can look after their basic needs, shelter, food, security, during the crisis. And a universal basic income goes a long way into providing that safety net. Now, people are saying, how can we afford it? How can we afford a universal basic income? And once again, I raised 3 ways of financing a universal basic income. 1, nationalise this country's mineral resources. Why should 2 or 3 individuals have billions of dollars in their back pocket while other people are having trouble paying bills, feeding themselves? 700 children live in poverty in this country. Over 2.5 million people asked for a food assistance in the last month. And the list goes on and on and on and on. Why shouldn't the natural resources, why shouldn't the mineral resources that occur in this country, as well as the natural resources, be held in common and used for the common good? Because that's what the concept of anarchism is about. It's about creating a society without rulers. What gives rulers power, as you know, is inequalities in power, inequalities in wealth. And the anarchist struggle is the struggle to share power, that's devolved power, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and share wealth. So a universal basic income is a step towards that type of a society. How can you fund it? Not only you can introduce a 1% turnover tax on the stock market. Now, if there's one organisation which has got no touch with reality, which is devoid of any real physical consequences, it's this country's and the world's stock market. They continue to luxuriate. They continue to be profitable. Investors continue to make billions of dollars every day by investing in the stock market, which has no connection connection with the reality on the ground, has no connection whatsoever currently with what's happening in the real world. It's like it's part of the social media empire. So 1% turnover, a 1% stock market tax, every time a bond or tax is bought or sold, goes into the federal treasury, would go a long way into funding the universal basic income. And the third tax I'm thinking about, which is nothing new. I mean, anything I'm talking about is not my ideas. These are ideas that have been around for a long time. Is a financial transaction tax, especially for large financial transactions. Because if we want to deal with disasters, and that's the key, not just disasters caused by a pandemic, disasters caused by natural forces, disasters caused by economic collapse. The way we need to deal with disasters to ensure that every person living on this continent has access to the basic necessities of life as part of our constitutional guarantee. It's all very well for the Premier of Victoria to declare a state of disaster so he can, be a one-man band and talk about, if the police want more powers, all they have to do is ask. It's another matter bringing the community together and providing people with the basic resources which will allow them to deal with a disaster. So the third thing that we need to think about is, as I said before, is a preparation, a universal basic income. And the third thing that we need to think about is how we are going to organise society. How are we going to organise society? Is parliamentary democracy an effective way of people being involved in decision-making processes? Is voting every 3 to 4 years and giving a representative power to make decisions for you for the next 3 to 4 years an effective way of running a nation? It isn't, because what we've seen over the last 100 years, especially over the last 4 decades, is the capture of parliamentary power by people who have resources. We see that the parliamentary agenda, whether it's at a state or federal level, is consistently designed to look after the interests of those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And it's quite laughable to think that we live in a democratic society. When I talk about democracy, I'm talking about direct democracy. People making decisions and electing or appointing delegates to coordinate those decisions at a local, regional and national level. We need to look at the political structures under which we currently labour because they have been shown to be ineffective. Look at what's happened. We supposedly live in a democratic society. We have a state of emergency declared, which means a small group of people can make any decisions they like. Then we have a state of disaster declared in Victoria, and it can be declared anywhere in Australia. Let's not forget that. And that means the government can ignore any laws that have been made in an attempt to deal with that situation. As we've seen in Victoria, if you want people to follow the rules, to assist us, if you want people to follow the rules, we need to provide that economic support. It's just extraordinary how long it's taken the federal government to introduce the pandemic sick pay of $1,500 for people who have got no sick pay. And let's not forget that over 40% of the population in this country is casualised work with no holiday pay, no sick pay, and the list goes on and on. We could have gone a long way to preventing the spread of COVID-19 months ago if that $1,500 payment had been made to every person who needed to isolate because they had COVID-19 or because they were in contact with somebody with COVID-19 for 14 days. many of the infections which occurred in nursing homes across the country, and especially in Victoria, occurred because poorly paid workers, casual workers with no sick leave, went to work in the early stages of the infective process. And now we are paying the price of government not willing to provide that $1,500. And let's not forget, let's not make it difficult. Let's not make it bureaucratic for this assistance to arrive. It should be a little bit like the $750 which has been paid to people on pension on two separate occasions since this pandemic began. It should be an automatic payment. People don't need to line up at Centrelink. People shouldn't need, to fight their way through, a computer to get a permit. The list goes on and on. It should be an automatic process. But the dilemma is, during a privatisation phase, government don't have the staff to implement decisions. And that's why we continue to have these extraordinary bottlenecks. And it doesn't matter how much the fines are going to be. It doesn't really matter. People will not follow instruction if they find themselves in a situation of having to pay necessary bills or, go to work. And that's the dilemma. And that's why we need to, as I said before, look at the idea of universal basic income. Look at the idea of how to fund the universal basic income. Look at the idea of being prepared for a pandemic. Look at the idea of the type of decision-making process we have in this country. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program is being broadcast outside the studios of Community Radio 3CR, obviously with the help of Community Radio 3CR. Without the good folk at community radio stations across this country, community radio would have died long ago. And I offer my congratulations and my support to all those community radio workers across the country who have been working very hard to ensure that this voice of community radio continues to provide opinions which are not heard in the corporate-owned media and the government-gelded ABC. These are reactive media, and especially the corporate-owned media. I mean, the corporate-owned media is about advertising, but we'll talk about that later on. My name's Joseph Toscano. If you want to leave a message, 0439 395 489. If you want change, I encourage you to look at the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest website, PIBCI, PIBCI.net, PIBCI.net. As I said, we need about 120 members to register as a federal political party. You can always download the application form from info@pibci.net, or just go to pibci.net, download the application form, fill it out, send it by mail, or just email it back to us, and you'll get all the necessary details once we receive the application. As I said before, change does not occur by complaining and carrying on. Now, I'm lecturing like the Premier here of Victoria, but if you want change, you need to become involved. You need to become part of an organisation. You need to be involved in the process. And Public Interest Before Corporate Interest does give you that opportunity. Now, other websites you can look at, you can go to my personal page, Joseph Toscano, or Toscano for the Public. Remember, this program is podcast. You can access the podcast at any time at 3cr.org.au. And as the post offices are still open, you can always write to me at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Now, as I said before, I can give you the most stupid analysis, the most brilliant analysis, but at the end of the day, what I say doesn't really matter. What matters is if you take that next step and become involved in activity to change society, because a lot of people have forgotten why we find ourselves in Australia we were in such a powerful position and now find ourselves in such a weak position. And they forget that we find ourselves in this position where we seem to be incapable of dealing with any disaster. Incapable. Because the far too long, we have put the needs of the few before the needs of the many. For far too long, we have lauded the investment class, that small section of society that uses this country investment-friendly taxation laws to enrich themselves to the rest of the community. For far too long, we have seen the billionaires and the millionaires as the heroes in the society. For far too long, we have allowed the corporate-owned media, and to a lesser extent the government-gilded ABC, to determine the social, political agenda and cultural agenda in this country. For far too long, we have been spectators at our own trial. Spectators. We have been spectators. Democracy is an interesting concept. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. So we don't live in a democratic society. We don't have rule of the people. We have rule of Parliament. And Parliament, to a significant degree, is influenced by that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Rule of the people, by the people, for the people. There is no for the people. How could 25 million people living on a resource-rich continent continue to have poverty, especially childhood poverty? How could 25 million people living on a continent find themselves in a situation where 40% of the population doesn't even have enough money in reserve to pay for a broken hot water system or pay the rent, and the list goes on and on and on. And it doesn't matter how many police you have, how many armed forces personnel you have, how many laws you have, how many fines you have, how many people you put in jail. Society functions because people want to be part of that community and feel that they are part of that community and feel that their needs are met and their desires are met, that they're listened to. People will not be lectured to in the long run. They will not be lectured to, pandemic or no pandemic. And that is the dilemma we face today, that we are not being listened to. Now let's move on to some other areas. I'm sure you're all COVID-19 wiped out, but it is a difficult situation. It is difficult in Victoria. It is difficult in Melbourne. It is difficult in parts of New South Wales. And the possibility is that it could be an Australian-wide issue in the short term unless we take those steps. And as I said before, the first step that should be taken is the Victorian government should accept responsibility for what's occurred. Secondly, they need to bring people together, not apart. And that, the thing is, you can be as tough as you like. The reality is that if you've had kids, you know that your best result is when you include people. Okay, let's move on. Now, China. I noticed that Australia's thinking of banning that social media extravaganza TikTok, and there's been a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric. Now, look, I've got nothing. I find the Chinese Communist Party a particularly obnoxious organisation, but I think we need to understand how interlinked the Australian economy has become to the Chinese economy. Now, Mr. Twiggy Forrest, our $20 billion, our $20,000 million personal fortune millionaire, and Madame Reinhardt basically have made their fortune by exporting iron ore to China. Twiggy Forrest, the Fortescue Metal Group, exported 87% of the iron ore they dug out of the earth to China in the last few months. 87%. No wonder Mr. Forrest has diarrhea every time the federal government indulges in its rhetoric. Now, if you just think it's a mining thing, during the last quarter, that's April, May, June, 46% of Australia's exports went to China. 46%. 7.7 went to the United States of America. 46% of Australia's exports went to China. 3.5% to Japan. Think about it. 46%. So why, less than 90 days to the US election, why would you pin your hopes on the Trump administration? Why would you, in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis, worsen that economic crisis? What is the reason behind it? It really makes no sense. Now, I understand people say, well, TikTok, that data can be used by the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. Well, let's look at Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook, okay? These are $7 trillion industries. And last week, the heads of these organisations, which included Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook and Picard from Google and Jeff Bezos from Amazon and Tim Cook from Apple, were grilled by the House of Representatives Committee of the United States of America. And it turned out that these people were basically running a cartel that they used the data they had to kill off any competition. So let's not forget, and I'll go through this again, let's not forget that every time that you use one of these social media outlets, you are the product. Your information is what they need to sell advertising to make a buck. You are the product. And in many cases, it's worth the effort, and in many cases, it isn't. But you are the profit. So TikTok is really no different to Apple or Google. Governments can retrieve information. And it's very funny to hear that the Australian government is concerned about the Chinese government getting information about Australians from TikTok. The Australian government has passed legislation which allows them to get any information they like about any citizen they like at any time they like from Apple, Google and Facebook. The legislation is there. Whether they can do it or not is a different matter, but the legislation is there. So we need to remember that this is a significant issue and that, people say, well, we'll just sell our products to somebody else. Well, maybe there is nobody else to which you can sell your products to. Maybe being involved in this new values, so-called values war, is basically a waste of time, a dangerous waste of time, especially when we should be concentrating our efforts on dealing with the pandemic that we now have. And when Australians say, we're concerned about foreign interference in our democracy, well, let's talk about foreign interference in democracies. When the East Timorese, new East Timorese state was formed, the Australian government spied on that state in order to improve its chances of getting more from oil revenue in a sea between Australia and East Timor. Now, currently there is a case, the Kaleri case, in court, in the Australian courts, to which you are not privy to. We've seen the ridiculous situation of a man being tried in secret, jailed in secret in this country. And the list goes on and on. We are seeing people now being brought to trial because they have exposed the duplicity of the Australian government. Let's not forget it was the Australian Secret Service which was tapping the phone of the former Indonesian president. To say that Australia is not involved in activity around the globe with the United States and other countries to influence other countries is ridiculous. We have been involved in the business of regime change for generations. In the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen the results of that intervention in Iraq, where the current political situation in the Middle East, the current fragile situation is directly linked to that regime change, for the Australian government to say that it is different to the Chinese government, that it is different to the Russian government, it's different to other, say, authoritarian governments in terms of not trying to influence political outcomes, that is total garbage. You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Now, just sometimes you think, well, things couldn't get worse, but interestingly, Mr. James Packer, one of the heirs to the Packer, Mr. James Murdoch, my apologies, Mr. James Murdoch, not Packer, Mr. James Murdoch has left the Murdoch board. And he's left the board in the hands of his father, Rupert, and his brother, Lachlan. And he's made an in-principle decision which will cost him billions of dollars because he is sick and tired of an editorial policy which is pursued by the Murdoch media around the world in all its newspapers, all its social media outlets, all its television outlets, all its paid television outlets, and it's got extraordinary amount of reach, especially in the Western world, which has pursued an anti-CO2 global warming agenda irrespective of the facts. It continues to pursue that agenda. It continues to pursue a divisive agenda using race as a weapon. It continues to foster a situation which sees people like Trump, and he's been elected over and over again. So James Murdoch had enough. He's walked away. He has walked away from the Murdoch group because obviously he doesn't have a majority in the Murdoch decision-making process, and he's walked away. So congratulations to James from walking away from that putrid Murdoch swamp, a swamp that has had so much negative influence in Australian society, a swamp which continues to have negative influence on Australian society as I speak, as they continue their divisive, racist, anti-climate change agenda ad nauseum, week after week after week, despite the damage that's been done to the country, despite the paralysis that has occurred in this country regarding decisions to tackle climate change. And to a significant degree, also the response to the pandemic. So it's good to see somebody like James Murdoch walk away. So it highlights that there is hope. And if you feel depressed, if you feel squeezed, if you feel there's no options, if the pandemic, and especially if you live in metropolitan Melbourne and possibly regional Victoria, if you feel the pandemic has really got to a situation where nothing is possible, and as we enter a 6-week lockdown stage, a severe lockdown stage where police and military personnel will be have extraordinary powers to control your movements and control what you can and cannot do, while you have a premier and a government that seems to be incapable of actually reaching out to the population, you're feeling depressed. There's no need to feel depressed. There's no need to feel angry. I mean, if you get angry, you get exhausted. If you get depressed, you just sit there. We are in a critical time. We are in a critical time where we can overthrow the business as usual approach, which this government at the state and federal level, governments at the state and federal level in Australia have been pursuing for so long. We are at a critical juncture where people may be beginning to listen to different approaches to the situation we have. I think what COVID-19 has done, it has demonstrated the fracture lines in our society. It has demonstrated we are not all in this together. It has demonstrated the weaknesses of government policies. It has demonstrated the weaknesses of allowing this country's natural resources to be exploited by a handful of corporations and individuals who enrich themselves at the expense of everybody else in this community. It has demonstrated how mass media, especially the media empire, has such a negative impact on Australian society. Whether this will achieve anything or not is a different matter. Whether people will move forward and take action is a different matter. But what it has done, it has demonstrated those fault lines. And instead of, blaming the Chinese or blaming the people down the road or blaming the people, who speak a different language, maybe we are beginning to realise that we are in this all together. But unfortunately, some people are in a better position economically to cope than other people. Some people, and most of the people who will be making the sacrifices during the close down of the retail sector, will be poorly paid, casual workers. Many of them will not be entitled to JobKeeper. And obviously the government hasn't reopened JobKeeper, especially in Victoria. So what this has demonstrated is the weakness of the policies that we have pursued for so long in this country, policies that have been supported by Australians, policies like deregulation. Now, people think, government regulations, they're terrible. They're causing me a lot of discomfort. They're causing me a lot of problems. Well, the issue is that as far as government regulations is concerned, many of those regulations are in place to protect people. They are in place to protect you from being exploited by the commercial sector. They are in place to ensure the house that's been built for you is of suitable standard. They are in place to ensure that workers are fairly paid for their labour and are protected from unfair dismissal. They're in place to ensure that the environment is not destroyed for the sake of, creating profit for somebody else. So, and it's interesting to note that currently there is a huge push by the federal government to cut green regulation. So what is green regulation? Green regulation are those regulations in place to protect the environment from disastrous developments. Now we've got federal government intervention giving the states the power to decide what goes ahead and what doesn't go ahead. And with this push for jobs during this pandemic and with increasing unemployment, we will see legislation which has been put in place for decades to protect the environment being removed. And we will see increased CO2 emissions as a direct result of that legislation being removed. So every time you see a government talk about deregulation, think about the negative consequences. Think about why that regulation is in place. And as I said before, this is a period of great hope. Hope, as I keep saying, is the love child of desire and expectation. The desire for change and the expectation that change will occur. For far too long, there has been no hope in this country. For far too long, we have thought that you can't fight the city for all. For far too long, we have decided that struggle for radical change, struggle for major change is impossible. It is possible. And what the pandemic has demonstrated is how fragile this country is, how fragile the structures which bring us, supposedly make us a sovereign nation state are, and how that we need major changes. As I said before, I can talk to the cows come home, and that means I'll be talking for eternity because I don't own any cows. But as I said before, talk is good in terms of getting ideas across to people. But there has to be another phase. And that phase is organisation. You need to organise and then take action. In order to organise, we need to come together in new organisations. Some will be parliamentary focused, others won't be parliamentary focused, but they will all be focused on the need for change, the need to ensure the Commonwealth is used for the common good, the need to expand the role of democracy in this country, the need to remove the influence of unaccountable corporations from this country, the need to use our natural resources for the nation's good, not the good of individuals in this society. That is what we need to look at today, and we need to do it now. The next 6 weeks is a perfect time. There's not much you can do if you live in Melbourne, and obviously it's a perfect time around Australia. This is a perfect time to go to our website, pibci.net, have a look, PIBCI, have a look. If you like what you see, download the application form and join. We are keen to get started. We are very keen, but without your support, without your help, we won't get started. As I said before, this is a period of hope. It is a period of great hope. I know a lot of people say to me, well, at the end of this will all be business as usual. But it won't be business as usual because the economic and social and cultural consequences are so profound and will continue to be so profound that business as usual will not be an option. There are two options. One is increased authoritarianism, as we're seeing, where police and the armed forces have ultimate power, where we see Parliament pushed aside, and that is quite possible. That is quite possible. Or we see the creation of a society which is less authoritarian, where wealth is held in common, where people are involved in the decision-making process, and which direction we move in to a significant degree is dependent on how you act over the next year or so. So it's there. The options are there. We always have options. Human beings always have options. Sometimes it seems impossible, but we have options. We can create options. We can create change. We can be involved in that movement for social, cultural and political change and economic change in this country and around the world. Because ultimately, how we live, how we organise, what we do is dependent on what we think and how we act. You've been listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. We have conducted the program outside the studios of 3CR in Melbourne because of the current lockdown. We will continue to broadcast live every Wednesday via the Community Radio Network across this country. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. Things are not as bad as we think they are because we can change what's happening. We can make that ultimate decision. And the important thing is not to get too depressed, too angry, too frightened during this period. The important thing is during this period to do a little bit of thinking, a little bit of organisation, and get ready for the coming struggle, because this struggle has not ended. It is just beginning. You can go to my YouTube channel. You can go to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest YouTube channel, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. You can go to the website, pibci.net. You can go to the Anarchist Media page, anarchistmedia.org. You can send me emails at info@anarchistmedia.org or info@pibci.net. You go to Facebook pages, Joseph Toscano, Toscano for the Public, Defend and Extend Public Housing, everybody's business, and the list goes on and on. If you're not you haven't got a computer or a printer and you want an application form to join Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. And if all else fails, you can always write to me at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is podcast, and you can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. Listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's Sacred Cow Slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.